First and foremost, when we look at the position of the Messiah from the Old Testament position, and the Christians definitely accept Jesus as being the Messiah from the Old Testament. The Old Testament Messiah was not to be killed. This is established. You find this in Psalms. You find this in Psalms 91. You find this in Psalms 22. You find this, even Ismail mentioned Psalms 22:16 in the last show. But as you continue on, you find that Jesus was making a prayer in this Psalms, according, if you accept Jesus as being the Messiah, according to the Psalms. And if he's the Messiah according to the Psalms, then he was praying to be saved, and God heard his prayer. If you fast forward to Psalms 91, it makes it very clear. The verse that Christians use in Psalms 22:16 about his feet being pierced, this is a issue of contention. The Jewish Bible does not have that. Rather, it says that they were lions at my feet. So this is not a clear-cut verse saying about Jesus being on the cross. You mentioned Bar Ehrman, who is one who's is an adversary of the Old Testament, the New Testament in the Bible criticism. But even Bar Ehrman accepts the crucifixion. The issue is the Muslim position of the crucifixion of Jesus is a supernatural event in which he was saved. Bar Ehrman does not accept, or any atheist or agnostic does not accept supernatural occurrences, whether it comes from the Old Testament, the New Testament, or any book. So we would never accept Bar Ehrman to accept the position of the Muslims, just as he don't accept the resurrection of the Christians. So using him to say that Jesus was crucified, it does not deny the Muslim position. The Muslim position is that, yes, someone was crucified, but God miraculously saved Jesus from being the one that was crucified. So history bears witness that a man was crucified under Pontius Pilate. But the Muslim position is that indeed that happened, but it wasn't Jesus. God saved him. And when the Christians go back and read Psalms 91 and Psalms 22 and other Psalms where it mentions the Messiah being saved and protected and not harmed, even if you read Matthew, when the devil tempted Jesus, and he said, jump off this cliff if you're really the Son of God. For it is written that God will protect you. The devil is quoting the old scripture, that God will save the Messiah if you true. And
okay,
Jesus
Aqil,
said it is also
Aqil, I
written.
want to ask you, I'm going to give you an extra minute here, but I want to ask you, number one, why would the disciples make it up? And number two, who was crucified on the cross if it wasn't Jesus?
Okay, so first, why was made it up? We believe that what you have today, being the New Testament, is not an accurate transmission of the message of Jesus. When you study the message of Jesus, as we have remnants of, and the message of Paul, there's a big contradiction between the two. But Paul was the first one again to write on this issue. And we
no, what I asked you was before. Don't even bring Paul into it. I'm saying before Paul. Why would his disciples make it up?
Well, two things. We can't say not about Paul because Paul writing is an early writing. So what came after that is only is borrowing and taking from Paul's theology on that subject. Paul is very crucial because all of his writings are first. And not only first, but the majority of the New Testament writings belong to Paul.
So Paul you believe that the gospel writers copied Paul?
I believe they took from his theology and inserted that to a figure they made to reflect Paul's theology. Yes, but we believe with absolute firmness that it wasn't Jesus based on his own prayer.
So who was probably crucified? Let me put it that way. Who was probably crucified?
Well, I mean, some say it was Simon Cyrene who carried the cross. If you read that the gospel in which it mentions he carried the cross, it mentions he carried the cross all the way up to the event of the crucifixion. So, I mean, it's a discussion that we can have. There was a debate between James White and my dear brother and colleague, Zakir Hussain, on this issue, and he's done an amazing job of highlighting this fact here that is overlooked for many times. question is this. There's not one single reliable eyewitness testimony of the crucifixion of Jesus.
Okay.
You have not one.
Okay.
Because according to the Gospels, all the disciples fled. They were not there. There's not one person that can actually say, I was there and witnessed it, that testified to it and wrote about it. And
Okay.
if you mention John, then we know that the Gospel of John is heavily contended. But this is the reality of the matter.
And friends, if you want to engage with Aqil, you can find him on Facebook, Radush Shubahat. I think I said that right. Okay. Going to, who's next? I've lost my order here of who's next. Ismail. I'll go to Ismail. How can we, before we go to more questions, anyone like to directly respond to what Aqil said? Because I know we have only a certain amount of time in the show, but let's do that. Let's respond to Aqil first. Let's go to Eric, and then Jonathan, and then we'll come here to the studio.
Paul was not a direct eyewitness of seeing Jesus die on the cross. He received his information from the other apostles, as we read about in 1 Corinthians 15. That's an example of an indirect eyewitness. But so when he's saying eyewitness, he has to clarify, does it mean direct or indirect? Because both direct and indirect eyewitnesses are fine. There's nothing wrong with using either one of those. And there are eyewitnesses in John. Mentioned they saw the death of Jesus. As far as his contention about nowhere talking about the Messiah dying on the third day, the passage about 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is talking about the entire redemptive plan of the Old Testament. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about the Messiah. Now, there are passages about things happening on the third day, like in Hosea 6:2, and other places in Genesis 22:4, where God does something very specific on the third day. He does many special things in Israel's history on the third day every time. See it also in 2 Kings 25 and elsewhere. Jonah, chapter 2, verses 1 to 9. So, this whole third day motif is not necessarily looking for a one-to-one correspondence prophecy of the Old Testament. So it's referring to the entire redemptive plan of the Old Testament. So I'll be quiet now and let others weigh in.
Shocked that Aqil, he is coming with a new Islamic teaching that there was no book called the Injil. I'm very shocked. How about Isaiah 53:9? Ask any Jew, any Jewish person, it doesn't have to be a scholar, who is Isaiah 53 speaking about? Oh, the suffering Messiah.
So then who then was Isaiah speaking of as the suffering servant that's so famous? Look in the book itself. 8 or 9 times in that book, Isaiah names the servant. God knew what he was talking about when he told Isaiah what to say. And through the prophet, God said, my servant, Jacob, 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 my servant Israel. 8 or 9 times in that very book, Isaiah names the servant.
وقولهم إنا قتلنا المسيح عيسى ابن مريم رسول الله وما قتلوه وما صلبوه ولكن شبه لهم وإن الذين اختلفوا فيه لفي شك ما قتلوه